courses, it turns out that a lot of women and students of color, in order to be motivated, they want to see how their learning makes a difference in the world. And so providing more applications, not in any way reducing the rigor or theory in the course, but simply showing applications that show how a theoretical concept actually solves problems, made a lot of difference. We also found that our students have arrived in our courses with great levels of difference, particularly in computer science. Some had been programming since they were pre-teens or 5 or 6 years old. Others had never written a line of code. And so figuring out how we could make sure that everybody was going to succeed. So in particular, dividing our introductory courses into sections for those with no prior experience, those with some prior experience, and those with a lot, made a big difference. And then just doing a lot of work about removing unintentional privilege and bias. So I'm quite sure all of you have had the experience of teaching a course where there were 1 or 2 students who asked most of the questions and answered most of the questions. And I happen to be very proud to be that kind of student when I was an undergraduate in math rather than computer science. And so my feeling about this is that most of those students, they're completely unaware of the fact that by asking so many questions and answering so many questions, they're intimidating other students. But in fact, they are. And so we practice ways of just having a nice dialogue with such a student, just saying, you know, Maria, I love having you in my class. I love the fact that you ask and answer so many questions, but you probably don't realize this, but many of the students feel intimidated by the fact that you ask and answer so many questions. So if we could just have conversations in office hours about the topics you're interested in and let more students in the class actually participate in asking and answering questions. And it's surprising how well that actually works. We also found it's very important to give students, particularly women and students of color, access to early internships and research opportunities, because once again, if they can see how using knowledge they have learned can be used for practical things, it tends to increase the retention and also the likelihood that they will go to graduate school. We found that it's very important to provide, to let students see that there are successful people in the field who look like them. And so we take a lot of students, well, before, when one used to go to conference in person, we took a lot of students to TAPIA, which is the computer science conference for people with disabilities and people of color, and to the Grace Hopper Celebration of Women in Computing. As I mentioned, we do a lot of education with our faculty search committees, and we also focus on our co-curricular activities as well. And one of the things that was very important to me was actually to change the composition of our board. Now, since the Board of Trustees for a college or a university is largely made up of alumni, and it's made up of alumni who've already been very successful, because the board generally gives a lot of the donations to the college. And so our alumni, particularly the ones who've made a lot of money, are virtually all white and male. So if we wanted to have a more diverse board, we had to figure out how to add others. And so these days we're 50% alumni, but we have a number of more junior alumni on the board in order to have more diversity there too. We're 20% parents. And again, given that our student body is now so much more diverse, there's a lot more opportunity to add parents. And then 30% of the board are people who, frankly, are really committed to diversity in STEM fields, and they joined the board of Harvey Mudd because they see us as leading the way and really being a role model for other institutions. And that's allowed us to have a lot more women and people of color on the board. So computer science changes. When I arrived, or shortly before I arrived, we were running about 10 to 15% female in the computer science major. And even though we already had a pretty significant percentage of the computer science faculty being female. And within about 8 years, we managed to get to 50% of our graduates are female. And as of now, we are 50% female on in our department. If we look at racial diversity, you see big increases, Hispanic, Black, and Asians, and you see a major decrease in terms of the percentage of Caucasian students. And in terms of faculty of color, we've gone from 0 out of 9 to 3 out of 18. So what did the department do? First of all, they changed the introductory course, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then once they had changed the introductory course so that it was incredibly fun as well as rigorous, then students started to expect that the later courses should also be incredibly fun as well as rigorous. We eliminated student macho behavior. That's our term for the students who use up a lot of the airtime. We took the first year females to Hopper and then students of color to Tapia. We provided summer research experiences between first and second year, focusing primarily on women and people of color. And we also persuaded many of the big tech companies, so Google, Microsoft, Facebook, et cetera, to do early internship programs so that, and encouraging them to hire students right after their first year. And as I said, we recruited more faculty of color and women. So changing the intro course. The old course, everyone talked about it as learning to program in Java. Of course, it actually was an introduction to the main concepts in computer science. The new course was framed as team-based creative problem solving in science and engineering using computational approaches in Python. So notice that it's got collaboration, it's got creativity, it's got applications in science and engineering. And we moved to Python because, like Java, it's a very commonly used course programming language in industry. And unlike Java, it's a little bit more forgiving when you're learning it. We grouped by prior experience. So our colors are gold and black. CS5 gold is people with no prior experience. CS5 black is probably you've had an AP course in computer science. CS42 is you've either been programming for a long time or you've taken a bunch of courses in college or both. And again, elimination of macho behavior. So, well, everybody loves the new approach. The number of majors has roughly tripled. We have many non-majors taking more CS classes at higher levels, and we have many, many more students taking computer science at Mudd from the other Claremont colleges. So I'll just say that when you try really hard to change the diversity of your community, there will be bumps. When you bring in a lot of Hispanic students or Black students, when you had hardly any before, all of a sudden they will discover that there are things, the way you do things that actually privilege white males in ways that you were completely unaware of. And so I'll just say that when you change the culture of an institution, you have to expect that there will be things that you didn't realize were actually giving privilege to some students or faculty or staff and not others. And there's going to be pushback. But in general, I would say the progress has been really positive. So I think if you really want more women and people of color in functional programming, the thing you need to focus on is how to get more people into PhD programs. And one thing we know is that exposure to research as an undergraduate increases interest in grad school. One of the things I tell companies who are recruiting, but it's also true for grad school, is that very often women want to be in communities that value creativity, collaboration, and communication. as well as technical skills and knowledge. And it's important that you create a graduate or, you know, a culture that makes it clear that those things matter, because it's definitely going to create an environment that more women and people of color are going to want to be part of. When you're interviewing people, make sure that your incoming potential graduate students meet diverse students and faculty, and train the people who are going to be their hosts on diversity and inclusion. Once they're actually with you, build confidence and community among your diverse groups. And probably the most important thing is demystify the path to success. Now, the reason I'm saying this is, if you're a male student, graduate student, probably most of the other graduate students in your research group are going to be male. And probably there are going to be times that you hang out, whether it's playing video games or going to drink beer or whatever, that many of the females just don't participate in. And as being part of the dominant group, you learn things about how to be successful. You make connections that just aren't there for members of underrepresented groups. And so it's incredibly important to help everyone understand clearly what it takes to be successful. And one of the things as part of CRAW, that's now CRAWP, Widening Participation Step Women, is really helping people make the transition into PhD programs. So women make the transition to PhD programs, be successful, then making the transition to being a researcher, whether it's in industry or in academia, be successful, getting tenure, all of those kinds of things. And so just being very straightforward about what it takes to be successful matters. And now we are ready for questions. And I believe that was just about 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. We have a question from the chat. Lindsay Cooper, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, hi. Yeah, so I could ask my question. I don't really have a clearly articulated question though. It's more just rambling.
But that's all right, this is a social event.
Yeah, so let me try to turn it into a question. So Maria mentioned that there's some students who monopolize question asking during class, and that that can be really intimidating for other students. And this was certainly, like, it really brought home for me, like when I was a TA in grad school, I would, because I graded everybody's homework, I had a lot of insight into how everybody was doing. And I noticed that the students who were willing to ask questions in class were usually men, and they weren't necessarily the ones who were doing well on homework, right? So I thought, you know, if I had not been seeing people's homework, I would have a totally different perception of who was doing well, right? I think that we know, those of us who, you know, when we're teaching, it's often pretty obvious to us that those who monopolize the question time in class, they don't necessarily know more or have more background than the other students, and their questions are often really naive. The difference is just that they're willing to ask a question. So, but here's the thing, I want to encourage lots of naive questions. And I'm even doing this now in comments on the YouTube videos that I make for my lectures. And I always answer them because I want people to ask naive questions, but what ends up happening then is that I'm providing all this free outreach to mostly men, because men are the ones who ask the questions. So I'm not really sure what to do about this.
So Lindsay, what a perfect setup. So there's a faculty member, Colleen Lewis, who just moved to UIUC from Mudd. We are very sorry to lose her. It's a two-body problem. And she has a website called csteachingtips.org. And she has all kinds of suggestions for how you can encourage, how you can make the discussions that happen in your class engage many more people. And so I'll just say, I won't spend longer than that, because you can go take a look yourself, and it's a great website, has lots of great suggestions.
We
Thank
have
you.
another question from the audience. Could you give an example of one of the bumps that you have experienced?
Well, so we had, so there were lots of different kinds of bumps, but I'll give a couple of examples. One is that we discovered that there was a particular class, this happened to be in engineering, not in computer science, that where teams built a rocket and launched the rocket. And we discovered that what was happening was because that particular class had not changed the project assignment for many, many years, that groups of male students who, so it's a course that was taught in the spring semester, groups of male students would form a team in the summer before and start working on the project. And because both the prof allowed teams to self-organize, and because they hadn't changed the assignment, these teams were spending like 6 months working on the project ahead of the actual course. And then while they were actually in the course, bragging about what they were doing. And of course, it was almost impossible for anyone to catch up with them, but it was just a hopeless situation where the fact that teams could self-organize and that the assignment, the general project had not changed for many years, allowed a group of male students to do incredibly well in the course and make it very difficult for others. So that was one. A second example would be that we had, this was spring semester of 2017. We had a number of very unfortunate things happen. So one of them was that one of our Latinx students was found dead in his dorm room. Now, it turned out this was actually a fentanyl overdose, but the lab in the coroner's office in LA County, the machine that did analysis had shut down. And so we didn't get the report for 4 months about what he actually died from. And it was assumed that it was a suicide and that he was committing suicide because of his anger at Harvey Mudd College. None of this was true, but about 10 days after he died, a student across the street at Scripps College did commit suicide. It was a suicide, and she was a Black student, and she was very angry at Scripps. She'd gotten into an argument with the dean of students there. And of course, that just cemented the story that our student Willie had committed suicide. And it caused, I mean, we later found out that we had one of our student staffs had become radicalized and was telling all of our students of color that they don't want you here and they're all racist and na. But we ended up with student protests. And it was just really painful. I would say in the end, it was one of the things that caused us to do so much of the diversity inclusion training. It caused us to, for many faculty to actually feel like diversity and inclusion was something that they owned rather than something that the president was doing to them. So in the end, it was positive, but it was pretty awful. I mean, we had our faculty really love our students, and they invest an enormous amount of time in not just teaching our students, but mentoring them and doing research with them and all those kinds of things. And it was just very difficult to have faculty who had put so much into their students being yelled at and being told they were racist and all those kinds of things.
I have a question from my colleague Kuhn Klassen. So how do you eliminate macho behavior?
We simply have a conversation with the student. We do it one-on-one. It's very positive. It starts out by saying, I love the fact that you love to ask questions. I love the fact that you're so passionate about this. I would love to have you come talk to me in office hours. I just want to make sure that when we are having students ask questions that everyone gets a chance to ask them. And so I'll just ask you not to ask more than 1 or 2 questions per class.
And that works?
It works, yeah. I mean, it's done really positively. It's not, there's no blaming involved. There's no criticism. It's like, you know, super glad you like to ask questions. Definitely want to encourage dialogue with you. Just don't ask too many per class period.
Mm-hmm. And from Steve Zankovich, you mentioned that faculty and hosts have had diversity training of some form. Could you elaborate on what kind of training you have found to be effective?
So we've done a whole variety of things, but I think one of the ones that I think has been particularly effective is having people. So we do like many places, of course, not anymore, but we do a lot of these over lunch or over dinner, where we invite faculty, staff, and students to come, and we will have somebody talk about their personal experience as, you know, somebody who's gay, somebody who's Black, somebody who is Black and female, you know, just talking about their experiences and what life is like for them. And we've just found that it's been very helpful for people to see other people's perceptions. So for example, one of the experience that many women in tech have is, you know, when you go into a discussion and there's, let's say, 10 people around the table and there's either 1 or 2 women, it's quite common for when you make a suggestion that seems like nobody hears you, and then a male makes a similar suggestion a little bit later, and everyone goes, "Oh, Brian had such a good idea." And just having a conversation about that and talking about ways to address that, I think most men are totally unaware that that's a common experience for women. And so I think a very big part of it is really trying to talk about what people's real experiences are, and then talk about possible ways to address that. And I think the most important part is not blaming anyone. We all grew up in a society that is gendered, has all kinds of racial expectations built into it. And I think if we want to move forward from that, then we have to be willing to talk about how different people's experiences as being part of a community differ.
A question from Clara Martirosian. Did the small number of students help with reaching such positive results in diversity? Would the strategies applied in your school be as effective in terms of number of students, universities?
Yeah, so I will say that I first started working on women in computer science when I was at the University of British Columbia. And that's a largish, it has about 40,000 students. And we were able to go from about 16% women in majoring in computer science to about 27% in about 5 years. And they're currently 30-something%. And so we did very similar kinds of things. We worked on the introductory course. We worked on building confidence and community among the female students that we did have. We took students to conferences. We had speaker series where we had lots of women giving talks. We worked hard on adding female faculty. So I would say, and the other thing I will say is that over the last 6 years, we've been working with 15 universities across the US. And so it's everything from huge ones like Arizona State to much smaller ones like the University of Vermont, and working on helping them use similar kinds of strategies to increase the number of women and people of color. And it's generally been successful. So I gave you the numbers for Mudd because they're the most dramatic, and it's where I've been for the last 14 years. But we certainly had similar kinds of results at the University of British Columbia.
Brigitte Pianka asks, how do you build community groups for underrepresented groups? specifically students of color, without overburdening them?
Yeah, so so typically, I think it really helps to have a faculty advisor. And of course, it's better if the faculty advisor is a person of color, but it doesn't have to be. And then, generally we do things like we organize going to conferences, bringing in speakers, having people over to dinner at a faculty member's house, all of those kinds of things. And, just having discussions about what people's experiences are.
Samantha Froelich asks, do you look at have intersectional data, for example, students that are both Black and female?
Well, because it's a small enough place, yes. I would say if I see a difference, let's say for Black students, more of the women are doing engineering, which is a general engineering major, and more of the men are doing computer science. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. Obviously, in engineering, you're getting to build more things with your hands, and that may be, and it's, I would say for Latinx students, we see men and women both doing engineering. So engineering and computer science are the two big majors at Mudd. We see them much more equally distributed. So, I really don't quite understand what that difference is, except I would say that for our Latinx students, there's more expectation that that students get a high-paying job after they graduate, because there's more of an expectation that they would be supporting their family as soon as they graduate. Whereas I'd say my sense is that for our African-American students, there's probably a little bit more emphasis on going to graduate school. And so, but I would say, generally speaking, we've seen good representation of both women and people of color in the CS major.
This is perhaps a follow-up question. Justice Adam asks, much of the difficulty that non-white, non-male students face are of economic nature. Are there any programs undertaken by the school to address this now or in the future?
So we provide, so we're need blind for the students we admit. So we meet their full financial need. And we also, and so it doesn't matter whether they're a student of color or female or anything else. It's just, it's done on the basis of family income, family assets, all of those kinds of things. And probably on the order of 70% of our students get some financial aid from Mudd. We also have a scholarship that is not based on financial need, called the President's Scholarship, which is for students who add diversity to who bring both diversity and leadership skills to the college. And it's not diversity, it can be based on anything. So we've had white males who came from rural South Dakota, since we have almost no rural students coming, who've held the scholarship, but we typically have on the order of 8 to 12 students entering per year, and it's a full tuition scholarship for all 4 years.
We have a question from Jeremy Gibbons. Jeremy, would you be willing to unmute and ask your question, please?
I can do that, although I'm falling into my own trap by doing so with your previous question. I was thinking about application-oriented courses, the way you talked about changing the curriculum to make it more accommodating to women and to people of color, and the fact that making the course more application-oriented is a way of doing that. And that's something I've struggled with, because I mean, frankly, I love a beautiful theory, and I don't care whether it has nice applications. I love the theory regardless. But I suppose that's a a privileged position to be able to take. And if you come from a less privileged background, you can't necessarily assume that you can just study things for the intellectual curiosity of it. That's a luxury which I have, and I assume. Is that a fair position, a fair statement, do you think?
Yeah, so let me just say, while I was at the University of British Columbia, I taught a discrete math class. It's actually a CS course. And the reason I taught it was that while I was department head, and no matter who I put in to teach the class, they got crappy teaching evaluations. And so I just decided I would teach the class and figure out what was going on. And I added a whole bunch of, partly application stuff, partly, active learning parts of it and so on. And, I'm a mathematician by background, and I love theory for its own sake. And I got great teaching evaluations, and I taught it only for 2 semesters, but from then on, it got great teaching evaluations. So it was clearly just, it had a reputation for being a course that students hated, and they hated no matter who taught it. And about 20% of the students, so I did a lot of questionnaires while I was doing this to try and figure out what was making a difference, what wasn't. And so, for example, I would draw a cartoon for every lecture about what the concept was going to be, and et cetera, et cetera. And I had about 20% of the students saying, this course is really beautiful. I don't understand why you add all this quote unquote fun stuff to make it better. And the other 80% were, oh, this is such a great course. I love the fact that you add all of this fun stuff to make it better. And so I'm not sure if it's I wouldn't necessarily say it's a question of privilege to love theoretical aspects of things, but I think it's just, I think it's one of those things that we should value people who love it for different reasons. And by providing the opportunity to love it because you can solve a real problem, that's a good reason to love it, as well as the beauty of the theory.
Okay, thank you.
Lily Bryant, would you like to unmute and ask your question about inclusivity within the students?
Hi, so maybe I'll just read off my question. So my question was, do you have some insight into how to promote inclusivity within the students themselves? Has it been a natural consequence already of the structural changes? I'm a current student, and a lot of my peers don't even recognize their own behaviors being damaging. And I guess I also ask this from a perspective as like a teaching assistant, how can I promote it while I'm teaching too?
Yeah, that's a totally great question. And I think a lot of it comes, so I think one of the things that has happened over time is because we have worked so hard on being an inclusive, supportive learning environment, that there's some self-selection happening among the students choosing to come here. But it's still the case that there will be a variety. When the students arrive, there will be some students who like to be the fastest to solve a problem. And so there's some definite effort among our community to sort of, not to call them out for it, but to help them build a different perspective. And one of the things I have really changed in terms of my set of beliefs is, when I was young, I was very fast at mathematics. And the mathematics community at that point thought being fast on your feet was a sign of being a good mathematician. And over time, it became clear that being fast on your feet was not a particularly good sign of being a good mathematician, because there are people who learn things more slowly, who can find results that others don't find. And so there became a much greater understanding that there can be just really, really different approaches. And it's not that one is better than something else. It's that valuing all of the sort of insights and approaches that come to the table is really worthwhile. And so I think that's something we have really worked hard on. And I'll just say, I've been working on a discrete math, a Ramsey theory problem in graph theory with an undergraduate student for the last 5 months as a result of the pandemic. And it's been super, super interesting from my perspective to see, just because we've had a chance to work together so closely, how his understanding about ways to approach things has just blossomed. And if I had been sort of rating how good he was as a student to do research with in the first month versus how I see him now, oh my goodness, you know, it'd be completely different. And so I think one of the things that the older I get, the more I realize is how different people's learning, the path their learning follows and their development of knowledge can vary so much, and how important it is to be encouraging and enthusiastic and supportive throughout that whole process. So a totally different student who's just started his PhD at UBC in mathematics, when he was in high school, a math teacher told him that he wasn't good at mathematics. And he's one of those people who did not do well with long, complex calculations. He just makes mistakes. And when he came to Mudd, they showed him a different side of mathematics, and he turns out to be very good at analysis and abstract algebra and all kinds of things that didn't involve long, complex sets of calculations. And so just being an environment that gives people a chance to develop and supports them well on that path is incredibly important.
Kim E. Yo, you have your hand raised in Zoom. Please unmute and ask.
Yes, hello. Hello, am I here?
We hear you.
Okay. I'm Maria. I'm curious about the earlier part of the talk when you talk about the transition when Harvey Mudd went from something very white to something more a place that was more diverse. And so what kind of arguments persuaded the stakeholders, the board of trustees, the alumni, to make that change? What kind of arguments, and was it obvious that diversity was a worthy end in itself?
Yeah, so I mean, that is a great question, because when I arrived, I remember having some discussions with faculty who were diverse, and they just said there's no support for diversity here, and that people just don't care about it. And even while we're going through strategic planning, there was a lot of pushback on the board, because the board at that point was largely older white men. And my position was that diversity really matters in terms of building an organization that is going to be strong. And that if Mudd is as innovative in pedagogy and curriculum as it says it is, then it's one of the places that could really make a case that people from diverse backgrounds, from diverse ethnic backgrounds and religious backgrounds and economic backgrounds, all of those kinds of things, that if we could show that that they could thrive here, that in fact the learning community that we'd be creating for all of our students, and for our faculty for that matter, would be much stronger. And I think the thing we learned was that that was actually true. I mean, I'll just say, the best way to make me do something is to tell me it's not possible. And there were a bunch of people who told me it wasn't possible. And so I think it took a lot of, I just think that, you know, it took a lot of, there were times in the early days where it was really hard. So it took a lot of persistence, stubbornness to get there. But, you know, what's so interesting now is that almost everybody who's excited about Harvey Mudd these days, it's because of what we've achieved in terms of diversity. And, you know, it's many of the people who are major donors to the college are doing so because they really believe that having more women and people of color in all areas of science and engineering are just fundamental to the future of this world.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, so in some sense, the idea of diversity, more women, more people of color, by itself, there is that kind of resonance among the stakeholders.
Yeah, yeah. And what I would say is that the majority of white male students who choose to come to Mudd, they pick it because we're so diverse. Because they say, if I'm going to be functioning in a STEM field after I graduate, I'm going to be dealing with people from all over the world. And if I understand how to work well with people from lots of different backgrounds and cultures, I will be more successful.
I will just have to say that when I was in graduate school, that wasn't at all clear. I remember this wasn't about diversity per se, but I remember a senior professor recommending the incoming class of graduate students to work among themselves, and one man disagreed, and he asked why. Yeah, he didn't quite go into it, but I mean, if I read into his question, it was like, well, you know, I mean, the nature of the world, I mean, is a competitive one, and so if there is more for others, there's less for me. And
Yep.
so when I was in graduate school, it wasn't at all clear that there would be this swell of people, non-white people, make it, you know, in a sense, you know, sort of changing the default,
Yep.
so to speak.
So what I would say is the following. So, you know, when I talk to people who hire Harvey Mudd alumni, and they'll talk about how amazing they are, and they will say things like, you hire somebody from Harvey Mudd and they make the whole team better. You hire somebody from Caltech and you've hired one more smart person. So the whole parts about collaboration, creativity, good communication skills, and being a great member of a team are just something that the diversity goes along with that. Because, you know, I think all of us have encountered situations where in order to solve a problem, you need to bring people from a lot of different disciplines together and have them communicate effectively. And if you've ever done this, it's not easy. And so if you are educating students so they know how to do that, that's just one of their core competencies, they're going to be more successful in life. And so one of the reasons why diversity is such a huge asset is because you learn that set of skills. You learn to listen to people from different backgrounds. You learn to appreciate different learning styles, for just all of these kinds of things. And so, I mean, it's interesting. it's not just that I believe this is important. The world is now starting to believe this is important, which is a very good thing. And so those organizations and those individuals that learn these skills are just going to be more successful.
Satnam Singh, I'll give you the last question, if you wish to unmute and ask.
Okay, so where I work, we have a clear message that a diverse group of people, organization team, performs a lot better than a homogeneous team. And one way to bring along more people is to just have evidence that kind of demonstrates this, to convince skeptics. So are you able to gather any metrics which shows that the quality of teaching or other outcomes have improved by having a more diverse faculty and set of students?
Well, I think what we've been able to demonstrate is that when we have changed our courses to make them more successful for women and people of color, everyone has better learning outcomes. So, and so I think the way we would say this is that when we think really hard about how to support everyone in a course, the outcomes are better for everyone, not just for the people we were hoping to do better. And I think that's, also, comes out of all kinds of research projects and team projects. And, because of our success with women and people of color, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, I mean, we're at the top of their list for recruiting and it's partly they want the diversity, it's partly they want the skill set and the knowledge. So, I was just looking at on LinkedIn the set of people they recommended that I connect with, and of course it's mostly Harvey Mudd graduates, and the places that they're working for is just amazing. And so I think there's very good evidence for, I mean, if I look at my senior team right now, I have 9 people. It's 5 are women and 3 are people of color. Of course, I would love to have more people of color, but when I arrived, there was 1 person of color. So, and very few women. So, my experience certainly has been that my teams are better if they're more diverse, and it's not just race and it's not just gender, it's also what their background is and all those kinds of things.
We have reached the end of our time here. I would like us all to unmute and thank Maria.
It's a pleasure getting to know all of you.
Thank you.
What I'm going to do now is stop the recording.